Have you ever wondered how one of the most calculated dictators in history could make such a colossal, self-destructive mistake? We're talking about Adolf Hitler and his decision to declare war on the United States, a move that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. It wasn't just a tactical error, it was a profound failure of imagination, a delusion born decades earlier. To understand it, we need to go back to the 1920s, to a prison cell where Hitler was writing his infamous book, Mein Kampf. This is where the seeds of his fatal underestimation of America were sown. In his mind, the United States was not a powerhouse to be feared, but a mongrel nation. He saw it as a chaotic mix of races, fatally weakened by what he perceived as Jewish influence and cultural decay. He was obsessed with racial purity, believing that only a homogeneous, Aryan society could possess true strength and fighting spirit. America, with its melting pot of cultures and people, was the complete opposite of his ideal. It was, in his view, decadent, soft, and incapable of the discipline required for modern warfare. This wasn't just a casual prejudice, it was the central pillar of his entire worldview. He applied a twisted version of social Darwinism, a survival of the fittest theory. Two nations. He was convinced that a racially impure country like America was inherently fragile. Its diversity wasn't a strength. It was a fundamental weakness that would cause it to crumble under pressure. This belief wasn't just in his book. It guided his every strategic thought for the next 2 decades. As he began to rearm Germany in the 1930s, this conviction only hardened. While the world watched Germany's military might grow, Hitler was looking across the Atlantic and seeing only weakness. He pictured a nation consumed by jazz music, Hollywood films, and consumerism, what he saw as signs of cultural rot. He believed Americans were too individualistic, too comfortable, and had lost the warrior instinct that he thought defined the German people. He truly thought that if it came to a real fight, Americans would lack the will to endure hardship and sacrifice. What's truly astonishing is the sheer volume of accurate intelligence he chose to ignore. German diplomats stationed in Washington, D.C., military attaches, and intelligence officers were sending a steady stream of reports back to Berlin. These weren't vague opinions. They were detailed analyses of America's immense power. They described a country with almost limitless natural resources: oil, steel, coal, you name it. They detailed an industrial base that dwarfed Germany's, with factories that could be converted to produce tanks, planes, and ships on an unimaginable scale. Imagine being a German diplomat in the late 1930s. You're witnessing the Ford Motor Company's assembly lines, seeing the sheer scale of U.S. steel production, and you're sending urgent cables back home saying, "Be careful. This country is a sleeping giant. Their capacity to produce weapons is terrifying." These weren't just warnings, they were desperate pleas for a reality check. They pointed out that America's population of over 130 million could be mobilized into a massive, well-equipped army. But what happened to these reports? They landed on desks in Berlin, and ultimately on Hitler's. And they were dismissed, sometimes even mocked. Hitler and his inner circle, like Goering and Goebbels, were so trapped in their own ideological bubble that they couldn't process this information. They saw the diplomats who sent these warnings as being weak, as having been corrupted by the American lifestyle. In their minds, the numbers about industrial output couldn't possibly be right, because a nation as racially degenerate as America simply couldn't be that productive or organized. It's a classic case of confirmation bias on a world historical scale. Any piece of information that confirmed Hitler's belief in American weakness was accepted as truth. News of the Great Depression, social unrest, or political debates in the U.S. were all seen as proof of its internal decay. Meanwhile, any evidence of America's strength, its industrial innovation, its vast potential, all of it was filtered out, disregarded as enemy propaganda or the whining of cowardly officials. He was building a strategy not on reality, but on a fantasy of his own creation. So, as 1941 dawned, Hitler's view was set in stone. He was leading Germany into a war on 2 fronts, confident in his blitzkrieg tactics and the supposed superiority of the German soldier. He heard the reports from his U-boat commanders about the massive convoys of supplies, leaving American ports for Britain. But even that didn't shake his core belief. He saw it as a desperate measure by a country that couldn't, or wouldn't, fight its own battles. He was looking at the symptoms of America's awakening, but interpreting them as signs of its final decline. This delusion reached its peak in the days leading up to December 1941. While Japan was preparing its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler was focused on the brutal winter campaign in the Soviet Union. His decision to declare war on the United States just 4 days after the attack seems, in hindsight, like pure insanity. Why would he voluntarily add the world's largest industrial power to his list of enemies when he was already struggling in Russia? The answer lies in everything we've talked about. He didn't see it as adding a powerful enemy. He saw it as a formality. He believed Japan's attack had exposed America's supposed weakness. He thought the U.S. would be so consumed with fighting a war in the Pacific that it would be unable to effectively intervene in Europe. He famously remarked that he did unbelieve a country like America could even manage the logistics of a two-ocean war. It was the ultimate expression of his contempt. In that moment, he wasn't making a strategic calculation. He was acting on a 2-decade-old prejudice. He was so blinded by his ideology that he could unsee the reality staring him in the face, that he had just signed his own death warrant. This catastrophic misjudgment, rooted in the twisted racial theories of Mein Kampf, set the stage for one of the most pivotal and disastrous decisions in modern history. The sleeping giant was awake, and Hitler's ideological fantasy was about to collide with a devastating industrial reality. December 11th, 1941. Just 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a decision was made in Berlin that would irrevocably seal the fate of the Third Reich. This wasn't a decision forced by circumstance or treaty obligation. It was a choice, a colossal gamble made by one man, Adolf Hitler. He stood before the Reichstag and, with astonishing arrogance, declared war on the United States of America. This moment, more than any other, can be called the mistake of the century. To understand why, we need to look past the fiery rhetoric of that day. Hitler's speech was a masterpiece of propaganda, designed to project an image of absolute confidence. He painted a picture of America as a nation rotted from within, a decadent society run by a Jewish cabal, morally weak and incapable of waging a real war. He mocked its leadership and dismissed its military as a joke. To his cheering audience, it seemed Germany was simply swatting away another annoyance. He boasted that his U-boats would sever the Atlantic lifeline and bring this upstart power to its knees. But behind this public display of bravado was a breathtaking level of delusion, a catastrophic misreading of his new enemy. What is truly stunning is that Hitler was explicitly warned against this very move by his own top officials. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the head of the German Navy, knew the Atlantic was already a brutal theater of war. He understood that adding the full might of the U.S. Navy to the British fleet would be a disaster. He tried to tell Hitler that Germany simply didn't have enough submarines to fight both Britain and America. Hitler waved him off. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, a man not known for contradicting his Führer, also voiced his concerns. He pointed to the sheer, terrifying scale of American industrial potential. He knew from his own diplomats that the United States wasn't a fragile, decadent state. It was a sleeping giant. The warnings were clear. America's capacity to produce tanks, planes, ships, and guns dwarfed not just Britain, but the entire Axis powers combined. Hitler heard these warnings, but he didn't listen. Why? Because his entire worldview was built on a foundation of ideological arrogance. In his mind, nations weren't measured by their factories or their GDP, but by their racial purity and their will to fight. He was utterly convinced that a multicultural, democratic society like America lacked the inner strength and unity for a prolonged, bloody conflict. He believed the American people were too soft, too materialistic, and would never consent to sending their sons to die for a war in distant Europe. He saw America's pre-war isolationism not as a political stance, but as proof of its inherent weakness. He was blinded by his own propaganda. This was coupled with a profound strategic ignorance. Hitler fundamentally misunderstood the nature of global warfare. He was a continental thinker, obsessed with land battles in Europe, the vastness of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the complex logistics of naval warfare, and the decisive role of industrial production were concepts he never fully grasped. He thought the war against America could be won cheaply, with U-boats picking off merchant ships. He had no real plan for how to project German power across the Atlantic, or how to actually defeat the United States. He just assumed it would somehow collapse under the pressure, just as he believed Britain would have. He completely underestimated America's ability to react. He thought it would take years for American factories to switch to war production. He was wrong. The speed and scale of the American mobilization would become one of the wonders of the modern world. So what was the immediate result of this declaration of war? Before December 11th, American public opinion was deeply divided. While many sympathized with Britain, a powerful isolationist movement argued fiercely against getting involved in another European war. Pearl Harbor had united the country against Japan, but the sentiment against Germany was not nearly as universal. Hitler's declaration changed everything overnight. It erased any lingering debate. It presented a clear and present danger from both East and West. Hitler had single-handedly unified the American people behind President Roosevelt and given him the political mandate for total war, not just against Japan, but against the entire Axis. This single act unleashed the full, unrestrained power of the American economy, the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it. Rohr et to leave. Factories that had been making cars were now churning out tanks and bombers at a staggering rate. Shipyards began producing vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. This economic tidal wave didn't just equip the American military. It supplied the British, the Soviets, and other allied nations, tipping the global balance of power decisively. Germany was now facing a two-front war, on land against the vast manpower of the Soviet Union, and a war at sea, and in the air against the combined industrial might of the British Empire and the United States. It was a war Germany could not possibly win. The numbers simply didn't add up. By declaring war on the United States, Hitler took a conflict that was already incredibly difficult and made it utterly unwinnable. His ideological prejudice, his strategic short-sightedness, and his complete miscalculation of industrial power all converged in that one fatal decision. He thought he was demonstrating Germany's strength and resolve. Instead, he signed its death warrant. The road from December 11th, 1941, leads directly to the ruins of Berlin in 1945. It was a mistake, born of pure hubris, a lesson in how arrogance can lead even the most powerful to self-destruction. And it remains one of history's most compelling examples of a single decision changing the course of the world. In the grand, terrible theater of World War II, there comes a turning point not marked by a single battle, but by a dawning, horrifying realization in the minds of the enemy. For the leadership of the Third Reich, that moment began to crystallize between 1942 and 1943. It was a period when the sheer, earth-shattering power of American industry stopped being a distant rumor and became a very real, very present nightmare. This is the story of how a nation, once dismissed as decadent and unprepared, began to crush the Axis war machine under a mountain of steel. Imagine you're a German intelligence officer in 1942. Your job is to track Allied shipping, and your reports are crucial for the U-boat wolfpacks prowling the Atlantic. Hitler himself has staked the entire war on the belief that his submarines can starve Britain into submission. But then, unbelievable data starts trickling in from across the ocean. Reports of a new type of cargo vessel, the Liberty ship, being built at a speed that defies all logic. German shipyards, the pride of the Reich, took months to build a similar vessel. The Americans, they were doing it in weeks. And then, the reports got even more insane. In November 1942, a shipyard in California, run by Henry J. Kaiser, accomplished something that sounded like pure fiction. They assembled a complete 10,500-ton Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. P., in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel-laying to launch. This wasn't a one-off stunt. Across America, shipyards were churning out these vessels with an assembly line efficiency that was simply unheard of. They weren't elegant, but they were effective, and they were numerous. For every ship a U-boat sank, 2 more seemed to appear on the horizon. The math was no longer in Germany's favor. The Atlantic lifeline, which Hitler was so sure he could sever, was becoming an unsinkable steel bridge, built one Liberty ship at a time. The strategy to starve the Allies was failing, drowned by an unstoppable tide of American production. This industrial tsunami didn't just stay at sea. It crashed ashore in the deserts of North Africa. For the soldiers of Erwin Rommel's legendary Africa Corps, the reality of America's power was a daily, demoralizing spectacle. These were hardened, battle-tested veterans, masters of desert warfare. They were accustomed to scarcity, to making every bullet, every drop of fuel, every spare part count. They fought with skill and tenacity, but they were about to face an enemy that operated by a completely different set of rules. When American forces landed during Operation Torch, the Germans in Tunisia were stunned. They encountered an army that seemed to have no concept of limits. American soldiers fought with what German reports described as unlimited ammunition. They didn't conserve, they suppressed. If a machine gun nest was a problem, they didn't just send a squad, they saturated the area with fire. Fuel, a resource so precious to the panzers that it dictated entire campaigns, flowed in endless convoys to the American front lines. German soldiers would watch from a distance as American Gs casually used gasoline to clean parts or start fires, a luxury that was simply unimaginable to them. And then there were the vehicles. When a German tank or truck was knocked out, it was a significant loss, often an irreplaceable one. But for the Americans, a destroyed Sherman tank or a bombed-out truck was merely a temporary inconvenience. By the next day, fresh replacements would often be rolling off landing craft and heading to the front. German letters and diaries from the period are filled with a sense of awe and despair. They described fighting a hydra-headed monster. They marveled at the sheer abundance of American equipment. It wasn't just a battle of tactics or courage anymore. It was a battle of logistics. And Germany was being bled dry by an enemy that had an seemingly infinite supply of everything. Back in the heart of the Reich, one man had the unenviable task of presenting this terrifying reality to Adolf Hitler. That man was Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer was a brilliant organizer, and by 1943, his ministry was receiving consolidated reports from the front lines and intelligence agencies. The numbers he was compiling were not just alarming, they were apocalyptic. He began to quietly, cautiously, present his findings to the Führer. He laid out the data, chart by chart, showing that the reports of America's industrial output were not Allied propaganda, as Hitler and Goebbels so desperately wanted to believe. They were cold, hard facts. In 1942 alone, the United States had produced over 47,000 aircraft. To put that in perspective, that was more planes than the Luftwaffe had built in the 3 years since the war began in 1939. America was literally outproducing Germany's entire air war effort in a single year. The figures for tanks were just as grim. America's factories were churning out more armored vehicles than Germany and its ally, Italy, combined. The iconic Sherman tank, while perhaps not as technically superior as a German Tiger in a one-on-one duel, was being produced in such overwhelming numbers that it didn't matter. For every Tiger on the battlefield, the Allies could field a dozen Shermans. And then there was the most fundamental element of modern warfare: logistics, carried by trucks. America's production of military trucks dwarfed the entire Axis bloc put together. The Red Army was being motorized by American Studebakers, and Allied armies everywhere were being supplied by an unmatched fleet of vehicles. How did Hitler react to this information? With denial. He looked at Speer's meticulously prepared charts and accused his trusted minister of being a fool, of being deceived by enemy lies and Jewish American propaganda. He couldn't, or wouldn't, accept that the industrial nation he had so readily dismissed could achieve such a feat. In his worldview, the decadent, racially mixed United States was incapable of this kind of organized, monumental effort. But Speer knew the truth. The numbers didn't lie. This was the quiet turning point. It wasn't a single event, but a creeping, undeniable realization. While German soldiers fought and died with incredible bravery on the Eastern Front and in the sands of Africa, the war was also being foretold. One in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the steel mills of Pittsburgh. The Third Reich, a regime built on an ideology of strength and will, was being systematically dismantled by something far more mundane and far more powerful: industrial mathematics. The roar of American factories was becoming the death knell of Hitler's empire. The giant had awakened, and its shadow now fell over the whole of Europe. The year is 1944. The skies over Germany, once ruled by the Luftwaffe, are now darkened by swarms of American bombers. On Tegrun in the fields of Normandy, the U.S. Army is a torrent pouring into the heart of Hitler's fortress Europe. This is the moment the myth shatters. This is the moment Hitler is forced to confront the American giant he so fatally underestimated. For years, Adolf Hitler had built his worldview on a foundation of racial ideology. He dismissed the United States as a mongrel society, a nation weakened by its diversity, incapable of true martial spirit. He believed it was a decadent, consumerist culture that would crumble at the first sign of real hardship. But as the war entered its final, brutal phase, the reality of American power became a tidal wave that his ideology could no longer hold back. The numbers alone were staggering, a testament to what was called the arsenal of democracy. American factories, running 24 hours a day, were churning out war material on a scale the world had never seen. Let's just try to comprehend the figures. Over the course of the war, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft. Imagine that. 300,000 planes. They also built 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and a staggering 2.5 million trucks that formed the logistical backbone of the Allied advance. On the seas, the U.S. Navy expanded at a breathtaking rate, launching over 8,800 naval vessels, from gargantuan aircraft carriers to humble landing craft. This wasn't just production, it was a miracle of industrial might. It was a force that Hitler and his inner circle simply could not comprehend. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, was a man who understood numbers. He saw the reports, he saw the intelligence, and he knew the war was lost. He tried to warn Hitler, to make him face the grim arithmetic. In one famous meeting, Speer presented the Führer with the cold, hard facts. He informed him that in the single month of July 1944, the United States had produced more fighter planes than the entire German aircraft industry had managed to build in a full year. The American industrial output was so vast that they were building planes faster than the Luftwaffe could ever hope to shoot them down. How did Hitler react to this dose of reality? Did he reevaluate his strategy? Did he acknowledge his mistake? No. He exploded in a fit of rage. He accused Speer of being a defeatist. He screamed that the Americans were using fake numbers, that it was all a bluff, a propaganda trick. His entire reality was built on the premise of German superiority and American weakness. To accept Speer's figures would have meant accepting that his entire worldview, the very ideology that fueled his war, was a lie, and that was something he was psychologically incapable of doing. This denial became a recurring theme in the final year of the Reich. Even as Allied bombers systematically turned German cities into seas of rubble, Hitler clung to his delusion. He would watch newsreels of bombed-out cities like Dresden and Hamburg, and still insist that the American spirit was brittle. He was convinced that the American public, seeing the casualty lists from the Battle of the Bulge or the bloody fighting in the Pacific, would lose its will to fight. He truly believed they would demand a negotiated peace, that the soft American society would collapse under the pressure of sustained losses. He saw the world not as it was, but as his twisted ideology dictated it should be. He pointed to the heavy American casualties in battles like the Hurtgen Forest as proof. See? He would argue. They can't take it. They are weak. But he failed to understand a fundamental truth about the American psyche. While Americans mourned their dead, their resolve didn't break. It hardened. Every casualty report, every gold star flag in a window, only strengthened the determination to see the war through to unconditional surrender. The industrial power was matched by a political and social will that Hitler refused to see. This delusion continued right up to the very end. In April of 1945, with the Red Army closing in on his Berlin bunker, the world he had created was literally collapsing on top of him. The roar of Soviet artillery was the soundtrack to the Jittermeering, the twilight of his gods. In these final, disparate days, surrounded by his most loyal followers, what did Hitler talk about? Ranted. He ranted about betrayal, about the failure of his generals, and, incredibly, he was still ranting about the Americans. Even then, with his regime reduced to a few blocks of a ruined city, He insisted that the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union would shatter. He predicted that the Americans, being too soft and too materialistic, would never have the stomach to confront the Soviets long term. He was still waiting for the enemy coalition to collapse, still clinging to the hope of a last-minute miracle born from his own prejudices. He was blind to the fact that the war was already decided. It wasn't won or lost in the final, frantic moments in a concrete bunker. It had been won years earlier in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the assembly lines of Texas. The fall of the Third Reich is a stark lesson in the danger of ideology over reality. Hitler didn't underestimate the United States because he lacked information. His intelligence services, while flawed, provided him with enough data to understand the scale of American mobilization. He had the reports. He had the numbers. He underestimated the United States because his worldview made it impossible for him to believe the truth. He was trapped in an intellectual prison of his own making, a prison built from racial myths and theories of cultural supremacy. In the end, it wasn't a question of fighting spirit or racial purity. The war was won by logistics, production by industrial capacity. It was won by the nation that could build 300,000 planes and send millions of tons of supplies across an ocean. Hitler's belief in the power of will and ideology shattered against the hard, unyielding reality of American steel. The American giant, once dismissed as a sleepy, clumsy oaf, had awakened and delivered a blow from which the Third Reich would never recover. It's a powerful reminder that in the great conflicts of history, facts are stubborn things, and no amount of delusion can ultimately stand against the overwhelming weight of reality. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis interesting, be sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments what other historical miscalculations you'd like us to cover. See you next time.